Ben Rodriguez wiped the dirt from his hands and stood up slowly. His small garden behind the apartment building was finally showing signs of progress. The tomatoes were growing well, and the herbs he had planted last month were already spreading their green leaves toward the afternoon sun. He had been working in this tiny patch of earth for 3 years now, ever since he returned to Earth. Most people thought it was strange that a former space engineer would choose to grow vegetables in a cramped city backyard. But Ben found peace in the simple work of making things grow. The sun felt warm on his back as he reached for his water bottle. That was when everything changed. A shadow fell across his garden, blocking out the light completely. Ben looked up, expecting to see a cloud, but instead saw something impossible. A massive ship hung silently in the sky above his apartment building. The vessel was sleek and beautiful, made of what looked like polished metal that shifted colors in the sunlight. Ben's heart began to race. He knew that ship design. He had seen it before, on a world very far from Earth. The ship descended without making any sound. It was easily the size of a small building, but it moved through the air as gently as a falling leaf. Other people in the neighborhood were starting to notice. Ben could hear voices from nearby apartments, people calling out in surprise and fear. The ship touched down in the small courtyard behind the apartment building. There was barely enough room for it to land. Ben stood frozen, still holding his water bottle, as a section of the ship's hull began to glow and then disappeared entirely. A figure stepped out. Ben's breath caught in his throat. Even after 3 years, he recognized her immediately. Queen Zara of the Velian Empire stood before him, as tall and graceful as he remembered. Her skin had a crystalline quality that caught and reflected light in patterns that seemed to shift with her emotions. Her eyes were like liquid starlight, deep and bright at the same time. She wore simple robes that seemed to flow around her like water. But something was different. The composed, regal expression he remembered was gone. Instead, her face showed something he had never seen on a Velian before. She looked vulnerable. Almost human. Ben Rodriguez, she said, and her voice carried the same musical quality he remembered. But there was a tremor in it that made his chest tight. Zara, he managed to say. His voice came out as barely a whisper. They stood looking at each other across the small garden. Ben became aware that his neighbors were watching from their windows, but he could not bring himself to care. All he could see was the alien queen who had once been his closest friend on a world millions of miles away. "You are well," Zara observed, though it sounded more like a question than a statement. "I'm well," Ben confirmed. "You look different." Zara touched her face with one long-fingered hand. "Do I?" "Perhaps. Many things have changed since you left us." The way she said "left us" made Ben's stomach clench with guilt. It was an old pain, one he had tried to bury in the soil of his little garden for 3 years. "Would you like to sit down?" Ben asked, gesturing toward the small bench he had built against the back wall of the building. "I can make tea." Zara nodded and moved toward the bench with that fluid grace that all Velians seemed to possess. Ben noticed that she moved more slowly than he remembered, as if she were carrying a great weight. As Ben went into his apartment to make tea, his mind raced back to his time on Velia. 3 years ago, he had been part of a small research team studying agricultural techniques on various worlds. Their ship had been damaged in a meteor shower and forced to make an emergency landing on Velia. What they found there had broken Ben's heart. The Velian people were dying. Not from war or disease, but from hunger. A blight had infected their crops generations ago, and despite their advanced technology, they had never been able to stop it. The blight consumed everything they tried to grow, leaving the soil dead and useless. Ben's crewmates had been focused on repairing their ship and getting home. But Ben could not ignore what he saw. Entire cities of people slowly starving, eating processed nutrients that kept them alive but provided no real nourishment. Children who had never tasted fresh food. Farms that had been abandoned for decades. So while his team worked on the ship, Ben threw himself into understanding the blight. The Velians were brilliant scientists, far more advanced than humans in most ways. But Ben brought something different to the problem. He brought stubborn human determination and a refusal to accept that the situation was hopeless. After weeks of research, Ben discovered something remarkable. The blight was not actually a disease in the traditional sense. It was a living organism that had become unbalanced in the soil ecosystem. The Velians' attempts to kill it with technology had only made it stronger and more aggressive. But Ben's human gut bacteria, when properly cultivated and introduced to the Velian soil, created a symbiotic relationship that could neutralize the blight. Even more surprisingly, he found that human emotional responses somehow enhanced the healing process. Velians had evolved past emotions long ago, considering them inefficient and disruptive. They made decisions based on logic and probability, not feelings. But Ben's emotional investment in solving their problem seemed to create some kind of bioresonance field that made the bacterial treatment more effective. When Ben was angry about the children going hungry, the bacteria worked faster. When he felt hope about a successful test, the plants grew stronger. When he felt determination to solve the problem, the blight retreated more completely. The Velians could not understand it, but they could measure it. Ben's emotions were somehow making their world heal. Queen Zara had been assigned to work with Ben during his research. As the leader of her people, she wanted to understand exactly how the human was achieving what their best scientists could not. She spent long hours with Ben in the laboratories and in the field, observing his methods and asking careful questions. Over those months, something unprecedented happened. Zara began to experience what humans would call friendship. Velians did not typically form personal bonds. They cooperated efficiently for the good of their society, but they did not miss each other or worry about each other or enjoy each other's company in the way that humans did. But working with Ben changed something in Zara. She began to look forward to their daily research sessions. She started asking Ben questions about human culture and Earth, not because the information was useful, but because she was curious. She even began to experience something like humor, laughing at Ben's stories about his life before space travel. Ben, for his part, came to deeply respect Zara's intelligence and dedication to her people. He enjoyed teaching her about human agricultural techniques and was amazed by her ability to understand complex biological systems. He also found himself caring about her in a way that surprised him. The breakthrough came 6 months after the humans had landed on Valia. Ben and Zara had successfully treated several test fields, and the crops were growing healthy and strong. The bacterial symbiosis was working perfectly, and they had developed techniques for cultivating and maintaining it. But then the rescue ship arrived. Ben had known this day would come eventually. Earth had been searching for their lost research vessel, and when they finally located it, they sent a ship to bring the crew home. Ben's crewmates were overjoyed. They had been stranded on an alien world for months, and now they could finally return to their families and their normal lives. But Ben faced an impossible choice. The Velian agriculture project was just beginning. Ben had proven that the treatment worked, but implementing it across an entire planet would take years of careful work. The Velians could learn to do it themselves, but having a human present made the process much more effective. His emotional resonance seemed to be a crucial component of the healing. If he stayed, he could help ensure that the Velian people would never face starvation again. He could see the project through to completion and guarantee that future generations would have abundant food. But if he stayed, he would be giving up his life on Earth. He would never see his own family again. He would be the only human on an alien world, possibly forever. The rescue ship could only wait a few days before departing. Ben had to decide quickly. He remembered the conversation with Zara on his last night on Valia. They had been standing in one of the test fields, looking at plants that grew tall and healthy under the alien stars. "You will leave tomorrow," Zara had said. It was not a question. "Yes," Ben had replied. "My people are waiting for me. You have done something wonderful here. My people will not forget. You'll be able to continue the work. I've taught you everything I know." Zara had been quiet for a long time. When she finally spoke, her voice carried an odd quality that Ben had never heard from a Velian before. "Will you forget us, Ben Rodriguez?" "Never," Ben had said, and meant it. "Nor will I forget you." That had been 3 years ago. Ben had returned to Earth and tried to resume his normal life. He had taken a job with an agricultural company, using his experience to help develop new farming techniques. But nothing felt the same. He kept thinking about Velia, wondering how the project was progressing, hoping that Zara and her people were thriving. Eventually, he had quit his job and moved to this small apartment, where he could work in his garden and try to find peace with his decision. Now Ben came back outside with 2 cups of tea, and found Zara sitting very still on his bench. She was looking at his tomato plants with an expression of deep concentration. "These are growing well," she said as he handed her the tea. "Thank you. I've been working on this garden since I came back to Earth." "You have been back for 3 years, 2 months, and 16 days, Zara said with typical Velian precision. Ben sat down beside her on the bench. "You've been counting?" "Yes." They sat in silence for a while, drinking their tea. Ben could hear the sounds of the city around them, but somehow the small garden felt separate from all of that. It felt peaceful, like the quiet fields of Velia. "How is the agriculture project going?" Ben finally asked. Zara set down her teacup and turned to look at him directly. "That is why I am here, Ben Rodriguez." Something in her tone made Ben's stomach tighten with worry. "What's wrong?" "The blight has returned." Ben felt like he had been punched. "But the bacterial treatment should prevent that." "Did something go wrong with the cultivation?" "No. We followed your methods exactly. For 2 years, everything grew perfectly. Our people were well fed for the first time in generations. Children tasted fresh fruit. Families gathered for meals with foods they had grown in their own soil." "Then what happened?" Zara was quiet for a moment, and Ben could see that she was struggling with something. When Velians struggled, it usually meant they were dealing with a problem that logic could not solve. "The blight evolved," she said finally. "It adapted to our defenses and became stronger. Our scientists believe that without the human emotional resonance component, the bacterial symbiosis was incomplete. It worked for a time, but it was not stable enough to prevent the blight from developing resistance." Ben felt a wave of guilt and regret. "I should have stayed." "No," Zara said firmly. "You made the choice that was right for you. I understand that now. But your people are suffering again." "Yes. But that is not the only reason I have come." Ben looked at her, waiting. Zara stood up and walked to the edge of his garden. She touched one of his tomato plants gently, and Ben noticed that the plant seemed to brighten slightly at her touch. "When you left, something changed among my people. Something unexpected." "What kind of change?" "Your time with us had an effect that we did not anticipate. Through working closely with you, many of us began to experience what you would call emotions. We began to feel curiosity, and satisfaction, and something like happiness when the crops grew well." Ben listened carefully. This was not what he had expected to hear. "After you departed, our scientists determined that these emotional responses were inefficient and potentially disruptive to our society. They recommended that we suppress these feelings and return to our traditional ways of purely logical decision-making." "And did you?" "We tried to. And we succeeded, mostly." Zara's voice became very quiet. "But in doing so, we lost something precious." She turned back to face him, and Ben was shocked to see that her eyes were bright with what looked like tears. "We lost the ability to hope, Ben Rodriguez. We became efficient again, but we also became empty. We could solve technical problems, but we could not remember why solving them mattered. We saved our bodies from the blight, but we lost our souls." Ben stood up and took a step toward her. "Zara. I missed you so much, human," she said, and now the tears were definitely real. "Every day for 3 years, 2 months, and 16 days, I have missed you. I have missed the way you would get excited about a successful experiment. I have missed the way you would worry about children you had never met. I have missed the way you made me feel that our work mattered not just for survival, but for something more. Ben felt his own eyes beginning to water. I missed you too. My people are dying again, not just from hunger, but from emptiness. The young ones ask why we should bother fighting the blight if life is nothing but survival. Our scientists have solutions to problems, but no one cares enough to implement them. Zara stepped closer to Ben, and he could see the desperation in her crystalline features. I need you to come back with me. Not just to solve the agricultural problem, but to help us remember how to feel. To help us remember why life is worth living. Ben felt the weight of the choice settling on his shoulders again. But this time, it felt different. This time, he was not just choosing between his old life and helping strangers. He was choosing between staying comfortable and helping people he cared deeply about. If I come back, he said slowly, it would not be temporary. I would need to stay as long as it takes to really solve this problem. I know. And I would want to establish something permanent. Not just my presence, but a real cultural exchange between our peoples. That is what I hoped you would say. Ben looked around at his small garden, at the apartment building where he had tried to build a new life, at the city beyond. Then he looked at Zara, and saw in her eyes the same hope and determination that had once driven him to solve an impossible agricultural problem on a distant world. When do we leave? He asked. The relief on Zara's face was like watching the sun come up. Now, she said. Ben packed quickly, taking only what mattered most to him. A few photos of his family, some of his research notes from his original time on Valia, and a small bag of seeds from his garden. Everything else could stay behind. As he moved through his apartment, gathering his belongings, he felt a strange sense of lightness. For 3 years, he had been living with the weight of his choice to leave Valia. Now, finally, he was going back to finish what he had started. Zara waited by her ship while Ben spoke to his neighbors. Mrs. Chen from the apartment next door listened with wide eyes as Ben explained that he was leaving for an important research project. He could not tell her the whole truth, but he promised to write when he could. You take care of yourself, Ben, she said, patting his arm. And come back to visit us. Ben promised he would try, though they both knew it might be a very long time before he saw Earth again. The ship's interior was even more beautiful than Ben remembered. Everything was made of the same color-shifting material as the hull, and the walls seemed to glow with a soft, warm light. Zara led him to a comfortable chamber that would serve as his quarters during the journey. The trip will take several days, Zara explained. You should rest. We will have much work to do when we arrive. As the ship lifted off from Earth, Ben stood at a viewing panel and watched his home planet grow smaller below them. He felt a pang of sadness, but also excitement. He was going back to a world where he had made a real difference, where his work had saved lives. During the journey, Zara told Ben more about what had happened on Valia in his absence. The story was more complex than she had been able to explain in his garden. The first year after you left was wonderful, she said as they sat in the ship's observation lounge. The crops grew better than we had ever imagined possible. Families had feast days with fresh vegetables and fruits. Children who had never tasted anything but processed nutrients discovered the joy of sweet berries and crisp vegetables. That sounds amazing, Ben said, though he could hear the sadness in Zara's voice that suggested the story did not stay wonderful. It was. But as the months passed, some of my people began to change in unexpected ways. Those who had worked most closely with you, who had spent time in the treated fields, began to experience emotional responses similar to yours. Zara paused, looking out at the stars streaming past the ship. At first, we thought this was simply a side effect of exposure to human biochemistry. But then we realized that these individuals were becoming more creative, more innovative, more effective at solving complex problems. Because they cared about the outcomes, Ben said, understanding immediately. Exactly. A farmer who felt pride in his work grew better crops than one who simply followed procedures. A scientist who felt excitement about a discovery made breakthrough insights that pure logic had missed. Children who felt joy while playing developed new games and songs that enriched our entire culture. So what went wrong? Zara's expression darkened. Fear. Some of our leaders became afraid that emotions would make us weak and chaotic like they believed humans to be. They convinced the council that emotional responses were a contamination that needed to be eliminated. Ben felt anger rising in his chest, but he tried to keep his voice calm. How did they eliminate them? Neural conditioning. A process that suppresses the brain centers responsible for emotional responses. It is painless and reversible, but highly effective. Did everyone undergo this conditioning? Most did. Those who refused were not forced, but they were excluded from important roles in society. They were treated as if they were sick. Ben was quiet for a moment, processing this information. And you? Zara looked directly at him. I refused the conditioning. As did many of those who had worked most closely with you. We formed what you might call a resistance movement, though we did not act violently. We simply continued to feel and to remember why feelings were valuable. What happened to the resistance? We were marginalized. Pushed to the edges of society. Some left the cities entirely and formed small communities in rural areas. They continued to farm using your techniques, and their crops remained healthy. While the main population returned to the old ways. They suppressed their emotions and focused on efficiency. For a while, it seemed to work. Society became more orderly, more predictable. But less innovative, Ben guessed. Much less. And when the blight evolved and adapted to our defenses, the emotionally suppressed population could not develop creative solutions. They could follow existing procedures, but they could not think beyond them. Ben understood now why Zara had come to find him. This was not just an agricultural crisis. It was a cultural and spiritual crisis that threatened the very essence of what made the Velian people who they were. When they arrived at Valia, Ben was shocked by what he saw. The planet that he remembered as vibrant and beautiful had become gray and lifeless. The cities looked the same from a distance, but up close Ben could see that something vital was missing. The Velians moved through their daily routines with mechanical precision, but there was no energy, no enthusiasm in their movements. The farms were in terrible condition. Fields that had once been green and productive were now brown and withering. The blight had returned with a vengeance, and this time it seemed to be spreading faster than ever before. But what disturbed Ben most was the people themselves. The Velians he met showed no curiosity about his return, no excitement about the possibility of solving their problems. They answered questions and provided information, but they did so without any apparent investment in the outcomes. Zara brought Ben to the royal palace, where he was given quarters near the research laboratories. The building was beautiful and efficient, but it felt empty of life. I want to see the affected fields first, Ben told Zara after he had settled in. And then I want to meet with the farmers who are still using emotional cultivation techniques. The resistant farmers are in the outer territories, Zara explained. It will take several hours to reach them. Then let's start now. They traveled by aircraft to the rural communities where the resistant Velians lived. The difference was immediately obvious. These settlements had a warmth and energy that the main cities lacked. Children played in gardens where healthy plants grew in abundance. Adults greeted Zara with genuine pleasure and welcomed Ben with excitement about his return. The human has come back, word spread quickly through the settlement. Soon Ben was surrounded by Velians who remembered him from his previous visit or had heard stories about his work. Can you help us again? Asked Kira, a young farmer who had been a child when Ben first arrived. The blight grows stronger every season. Even our fields are beginning to show signs of infection. Ben spent 3 days in the resistant settlements, studying the current state of the blight and observing how the emotional cultivation techniques had evolved in his absence. What he found was both encouraging and troubling. The resistant communities had maintained and even improved upon his original methods. They had learned to cultivate human-compatible bacteria more effectively, and they had discovered that group emotional sessions could enhance the healing process even further. When families worked together in the fields, sharing their hopes and concerns for their crops, the plants grew stronger than when individuals worked alone. But they were fighting a losing battle. The evolved blight was more aggressive than anything Ben had encountered before. It seemed to actively seek out and attack the beneficial bacteria, and it spread through soil and air much faster than the original strain. "We need something more than just improved technique," Ben told Zara as they flew back toward the main city. "We need a completely new approach. Do you have ideas?" Ben was quiet for a moment, thinking. "Maybe. But I'm going to need help from both the resistant communities and the main population. And that means we need to solve the emotional suppression problem first. The council will not simply reverse their decision about neural conditioning," Zara warned. "They believe their current approach is the only thing preventing social chaos. Then we'll have to show them they're wrong." Back in the capital city, Ben requested a meeting with the Velian High Council. He expected resistance, but Zara's status as queen gave him access to the highest levels of government. The council chamber was a vast, circular room where 12 Velian leaders sat at a curved table. Their faces showed the neutral expressions that Ben had come to recognize as the hallmark of emotional suppression. They looked at him with polite attention, but no curiosity or enthusiasm. "Human Ben Rodriguez," spoke Council Leader Varric, "we are pleased to have you return to assist with our agricultural difficulties. However, we must make clear that our current social policies are not open for discussion." "I understand your position," Ben said carefully. "But I believe the agricultural crisis and your social policies are connected in ways that make both problems harder to solve. Explain." Ben took a deep breath and began to present the case he had been developing during his journey from Earth. He explained how the evolved blight seemed to target not just the beneficial bacteria, but the entire ecosystem balance that depended on emotional cultivation techniques. "The blight has essentially become immune to purely technical solutions," he said. "It adapts too quickly for conventional approaches. The only way to stay ahead of it is through creative, innovative responses that come from emotional investment in the problem." Council Leader Varric listened without expression. "You are suggesting that we abandon efficient decision-making processes in favor of chaotic emotional responses. I'm suggesting that what you call chaos might actually be the key to survival." Ben gestured toward a wall display that showed agricultural productivity statistics. "Your charts show that crop yields in the resistant communities have remained stable while yields in the main population areas have dropped by 60%. The difference is not in technique or resources. The difference is in emotional engagement. Correlation does not prove causation," another council member observed. "You're right," Ben agreed. "So let me propose a controlled experiment." The council members looked at each other, and Ben could see that he had caught their attention. Velians loved controlled experiments. "Give me 2 groups of volunteers from the main population," Ben continued. "One group will use standard agricultural procedures with my technical improvements. The other group will undergo temporary reversal of emotional conditioning and use the full emotional cultivation approach. We'll compare results over a full growing season." "And if the emotional group performs better," asked Varric. "Then you'll have evidence that emotional responses are not just useful, but necessary for solving complex adaptive challenges like the blight." "And if they perform worse?" Ben smiled. "Then I'll recommend that the resistant communities adopt your conditioning procedures, and will focus purely on technical solutions." The council deliberated for several hours before agreeing to Ben's experiment. They would provide him with 200 volunteers, half to serve as the emotional test group and half as the technical control group. The hardest part was finding volunteers willing to undergo temporary reversal of their neural conditioning. Most of the main population had become so accustomed to emotional suppression that the idea of feeling again was genuinely frightening to them. But eventually, with Zara's help, Ben assembled his test groups. The emotional reversal process took several days, during which the volunteers had to be carefully monitored as they readjusted to experiencing feelings. Ben would never forget the moment when the first volunteer, a middle-aged scientist named Jorik, experienced joy for the first time in 3 years. They were standing in one of the test fields, looking at seedlings that had just begun to sprout. Jorik had been explaining the growth patterns in his usual neutral, analytical tone when he suddenly stopped mid-sentence. "They are beautiful," he said, his voice filled with wonder. "I had forgotten that growing things could be beautiful." Jorik knelt down and touched one of the tiny plants gently. As he did, Ben could see the plant respond, growing slightly taller and greener even as they watched. "How do you feel?" Ben asked. "Happy," Jorik said, and tears began to flow down his face. "I feel happy, and I had forgotten what happiness was like." Over the following weeks, Ben worked with both test groups, teaching them advanced cultivation techniques and monitoring their progress. The difference in results was dramatic. The technical control group, working with emotionally suppressed volunteers, achieved modest improvements over standard agricultural procedures. Their crops grew better than they had in recent years, but they still showed signs of blight infection. The emotional test group, working with volunteers who had undergone conditioning reversal, achieved results that astonished everyone. Their crops not only resisted the blight completely, but actually seemed to improve the soil around them. Plants in their test fields grew larger, more nutritious, and more flavorful than anything that had been seen on Valia in generations. More importantly, the emotional volunteers began developing innovations that went far beyond anything Ben had taught them. They discovered new bacterial cultivation techniques, developed more effective planting patterns, and created entirely new approaches to soil management that integrated Velian technology with emotional cultivation methods. "The results speak for themselves," Ben told the council when he presented his findings after 3 months of testing. "Emotional engagement doesn't just make the agriculture more effective. It makes your people more capable of solving problems and developing innovations." Council leader Varick studied the data carefully. "The improvements are significant," he admitted. "But how do we know that widespread emotional reversal will not lead to social instability?" "Because you can observe what's happening in the test communities," Ben replied. "The volunteers aren't becoming chaotic or irrational. They're becoming more creative, more collaborative, and more motivated to work for the common good." Ben brought several of the emotional test volunteers to address the council directly. Jorik spoke about how feeling invested in his work had made him a better scientist. Mira, a former city administrator, explained how caring about her community had helped her develop more effective resource distribution systems. "Emotions do not make us weak," Mira told the council. "They make us strong in ways we had forgotten." The council took 2 weeks to deliberate before announcing their decision. They would begin a gradual process of reversing emotional conditioning across the population, starting with volunteers and expanding based on results. But even as this victory was achieved, Ben knew that the larger challenge still lay ahead. Defeating the blight would require not just emotional engagement, but a coordinated effort between the newly re-emotionalized population and the resistant communities who had maintained their feelings throughout the crisis. "We need to bring everyone together," Ben told Zara as they planned the next phase of their work. "The resistant communities have maintained the emotional cultivation techniques, but they lack the advanced technical resources of the main cities. The main population has the technology and infrastructure, but they're just beginning to relearn emotional engagement." "A planetary collaboration," Zara said, understanding immediately. "Exactly. We need to create a network that combines the best of both approaches." Over the next several months, Ben worked to establish communication and cooperation between the various Velian communities. This was more challenging than solving the technical aspects of the blight problem. The resistant communities had developed resentment toward the main population for rejecting emotional responses. The main population was suspicious of the resistant communities, whom they viewed as having chosen inefficiency over progress. Ben realized that before they could work together to solve the blight crisis, they needed to heal the social divisions that had developed during the 3 years of his absence. He organized a series of joint cultivation projects where members of both communities worked side by side in test fields. At first, these collaborations were awkward and tense. But as people from different communities began to share their experiences and learn from each other, genuine friendships began to form. The breakthrough came when a combined team discovered a completely new approach to blight resistance. By integrating the advanced bacterial cultivation techniques from the resistant communities with the sophisticated monitoring technology from the main cities, they developed a treatment that was not just effective against the current blight strain, but adaptable enough to evolve along with future mutations. More importantly, they discovered that the healing process worked best when diverse groups of Velians with different emotional perspectives collaborated on the same fields. A team that included logical analysts, creative innovators, and passionate advocates achieved results that no single type of contributor could match. "We are stronger together than apart," Jorik observed as they watched a field treated with the new collaborative technique bloom with healthy crops. Not just technically stronger, but emotionally stronger. The success of the collaborative approach led to a planet-wide transformation that went far beyond agriculture. Velian society began to reorganize itself around the principle that both logical analysis and emotional engagement were necessary for solving complex challenges. Cities were redesigned to include green spaces where people could work together in community gardens. Schools began teaching emotional cultivation alongside technical subjects. Scientific research teams included both analytical specialists and emotionally engaged advocates. The blight was finally defeated not through any single technique, but through a sustained collaborative effort that combined the best of Velian technology with human-inspired emotional cultivation methods. More importantly, Velian society emerged from the crisis stronger and more vibrant than it had been for generations. On the day that the last infected field was successfully treated, Ben stood with Zara on a hillside overlooking the capital city. Below them, Velians of all ages worked together in vast community gardens, their laughter and conversation drifting up on the warm afternoon breeze. "You have given us more than healthy crops," Zara told him. "You have given us back our souls." Ben smiled, thinking of his small garden back on Earth and how it had led him to this moment. "You did that yourselves. I just reminded you that feeling deeply about something makes you better at it, not worse. Will you stay with us permanently?" Ben had been expecting this question. "For now, yes. But I think the real solution is to establish permanent exchanges between our worlds. Humans can learn from Velian technology and logical thinking. Velians can learn from human emotional engagement and creativity. We're both stronger when we work together." Zara nodded, her crystalline features bright with hope. "A true partnership between our peoples." "Exactly. And maybe someday, other worlds will want to join us." As the sun set over the thriving fields of Valia, Ben felt a deep sense of satisfaction. He had found his way back home, not to Earth, but to a place where his work mattered and where he could help others flourish. And in doing so, he had discovered that sometimes the greatest human trait was not individual achievement, but the ability to help others remember their own capacity for growth and joy. The garden he had left behind on Earth had been small and simple. The garden he had helped create on Valia was an entire world, blooming with the combined strengths of two species who had learned that feeling deeply about something made them capable of extraordinary things.